This is a supplemental study. It's not the first one. I did one a few weeks back on the book of Daniel. But what's going on here is that a few weeks ago we talked on Sunday morning about the abomination of desolation in Mark chapter 13. And we did that because we saw Jesus speak of it in the Olivet Discourse. And at that time, we saw that this was definitely referencing a specific past event in and around 168 to 167 BC, where Jerusalem was attacked and the temple was desecrated by setting up an altar to Zeus and sacrificing a pig on it. Have you guys heard of Antiochus and the abomination of desolation and such things as that? And we noted at that time that the ruler who did this thing was known as Antiochus IV. And this extreme act of desecration, combined with a systematic effort to eliminate Judaism from the land of Israel, sparked what is known as the Maccabean Revolt in response. This revolt was astonishingly successful, and it gave way to a 100-year era of Jewish independence known as the Jewish Hasmonean period. And interestingly enough, the Bible doesn't speak of this revolt at all. It speaks of it in the Maccabees. Have you guys ever read 1st or 2nd Maccabees? All the details are in there, and it's an apocryphal book. I think there's a good reason the Bible doesn't talk about the revolt, and we'll get into that as we go along, not necessarily this week. But the impact that this revolt had on the Jewish nation was so profound that it still affects them in the Gospels. As we're reading through the Gospels, that is still affecting them. For example, there are things like Pharisees and Sadducees and the Sanhedrin and such things. You ever read that and go, where'd all that come from? That's all a function of what happened as a result of the Hasmonean period and the Maccabean Revolt. And the idea here is that the effects of the Maccabean Revolt were such an integral part of the Jewish consciousness at the time of Jesus' Olivet Discourse that it's really hard to understand what he's saying in that discourse without understanding the issues that happened beforehand leading up to it. And so with this in mind, we're continuing in our efforts to understand the Maccabean Revolt. We started out last time by looking at Daniel's run-up to Antiochus IV's persecution of Israel. And in the process we saw, and I'm talking about a study I gave last time, I don't know if you guys have seen it or not, but in the process we saw Judah pass from national independence to being ruled by the Babylonian Empire and carried away captive, and then being ruled by the Persian Empire, and then by the Greek Empire. And then we saw how they found themselves in the middle of a border war between two successors of the Greek Empire, which were the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And eventually we saw how Israel landed under the control of the Seleucids and by extension Antiochus IV, who was a Seleucid king. And we also saw last time how Daniel taught believers to respond to persecution like that of Antiochus IV when it comes. That whole book of Daniel is talking about how to respond to persecutions. And he taught that in all situations of persecution, Daniel taught peaceful disobedience and reliance upon God for his preservation and for the preservation of his word and his people. And I'm asking you to make a mental note of this because this example of patience and persecution by Daniel becomes very relevant as we explore the details of the Maccabean Revolt itself. And it also becomes very relevant as we explore Mark 13 and how to respond to the future abomination of desolation that Jesus is warning us about. Whether you believe it's just 70 AD or whether you believe there's another one coming, the way we're supposed to respond to that abomination is directly affected by what's going on here, okay? With all that said, as we've already seen, the Maccabean Revolt was triggered by Antiochus IV's systematic persecution of Judaism. And with this in mind, in order to understand the revolt itself, we need to unpack an underlying question. That question is right here. What prompted Antiochus IV to persecute the Jews in the first place? What prompted that? Why did Antiochus IV enter the Jewish temple and sacrifice a swine on it in the first place and bring about all this problem? What a terrible move. Politically, it wasn't a great idea. What possessed him to do such a thing? And understanding this helps us to wrap our minds around persecution in our day and age as well. And with this in mind, we're going to briefly cover, we're not going to be here that long really, we're going to briefly cover the underlying circumstances driving Antiochus IV's persecution of the Jews, and we're going to talk about the specific events leading up to the abomination of desolation itself. And so we're going to look at those two things, and we're going to conclude with introducing you to a local priest by the name of Mattathias and his 5 sons, and we're going to see how those guys' response triggers a revolt, okay? So there's the underlying circumstances, the specific events, and then there's Mattathias and his sons. And so here's the circumstances. The underlying factor which drove the persecution was something known as Hellenism. Have you guys heard of the term Hellenism before? It's a big word, but if you were to really break it down, you're talking about the spread of Greek culture throughout the known world. And here's how Hellenism became an issue here in this particular situation. If you can recall from our last supplemental study, we saw that the Jewish people were once an independent nation, but over time they were conquered and they were carried off to Babylon. And eventually, Babylon was conquered by Persia, and the Persians treated the Jews very well in comparison to the Babylonians. Under the Persians, the Jews were allowed to return to Palestine from their exile in Babylon, and they were allowed to rebuild their temple and fortify their city with walls. And though they were not allowed to establish a Jewish king, they had before their exile, they were allowed to govern themselves semi-autonomously according to their own religion and custom and culture. And the Jews were governed at this time by not a king, but a high priest. And the high priest served as a ruler in all things, both religious and non-religious, throughout their land. But note that this high priest was a client ruler. His authority was bestowed upon him by the king, which generally meant that he was responsible for raising tribute and paying that tribute to the king annually in return. There was an arrangement there. Now, throughout Persian rule and most of Greek rule, the lineage of the high priestly family was respected and maintained throughout this arrangement. That is to say, the high priestly succession tended to remain in the family, and the tribute paid by the Jews was reasonable. However, later on, under the Greeks, this arrangement opened the door for a big problem when the right combination of corruption on both sides gave way for competing candidates of high priests to start outbidding one another, saying, I'll give more tribute than this guy in order to get the king to give them the high priesthood. Keep that in mind. The system's here, it's going fine under the Persians, but it's there, and we're going to come back to it because it becomes a problem. But for now, note that even though Israel was not an independent nation, it was technically a Persian province, and Judaism flourished under Persian dominion. It was doing great. The Persian kings generally respected Jewish laws and customs, and they didn't interfere with their way of life at all. They flourished under Persian rule. Now, we also saw last time that Alexander the Great of Greece conquered Persia. He did it so very quickly. And shortly thereafter he died, and his successors divided the empire among themselves. And we saw that by and large, both Alexander and his successors maintained the religious tolerance of the Persian kings before them. Alexander didn't make decrees infringing upon Jewish worship. He didn't do that. And neither did the Ptolemies. And when the Seleucid king Antiochus III came, he didn't do it either. Generally, they maintained a policy of toleration there. However, there was a difference from the Persians there was a difference from the Persians in the Greek period of dominion, which over time generated tension in the Jewish community. That is to say, what I mean here is that in the Greek dominion, there was something different going on. There was not outright decrees of infringing upon their religious rights, but there was something different about the Greeks that made this a little harder, and that is that the Greeks were colonizers. That is to say, as they conquered, they set up Greek settlements among their conquered territories. Thus, the influence of Greek culture was unavoidable, even though no laws were passed infringing upon their worship. And if I was to say this again, the Persians had dominion, but they weren't about spreading their culture. But the Greeks put settlements everywhere they went and spread their culture everywhere. And so to put it another way, though Alexander and his successors did not force their conquered peoples to outright abandon their custom and cultures, they set up Greek culture wherever they went, which inevitably influenced the peoples and cultures of the world. And it eventually got to the point where it was practically impossible to function in daily life without coming in contact with Greek culture in some way. And the classic way to understand this today would be something like this, okay, right here. How many of you remember when this device came out? It was 2007. I can remember seeing it and going, wow, that's really cool, that's neat, that kind of thing. We're 17 years into it now. And like them or not, smartphones have become so saturated into every aspect of our daily lives that it's becoming impossible to function day to day without them. We communicate through them, we buy and sell through them, we navigate to our destinations through them. You don't read a map anymore. Our kids can't find their way anywhere without putting it in the GPS, that kind of thing. We use them as flashlights in the dark. Some of you have levels. You can even do some carpentry tools with them. You know, there's things you can do with them. They're into everything now. And there's a lot of people out there who think that these smartphones aren't such a great thing, you know. But you really can't get away from a smartphone anymore without becoming kind of a survivalist or an extremist and kind of cutting yourself off from everything because it's so integrated into everything that's going on in society. That's exactly what's going on in Greek culture at the time. Greek language, Greek philosophy, sports, entertainment. It came to influence every aspect of daily life, everywhere under their domain, including Judea. And this was creating tension among the Jews. The Jews were generally dividing into two camps on this issue. There was the progressive camp, which embraced the Greek culture as a good thing. They saw Greek culture as a means for innovation and development. And a good example of this would be the Septuagint. Have you guys heard of the Septuagint? That came into being during this period. And this is because as time went on, all of the known world became fluent in the Greek language. And this enabled the Jewish Old Testament to be translated into a language that everyone could understand. And therefore, the Greek Old Testament, or the Hebrew Old Testament, could be understood by everyone. It's a very interesting thing to see. And by the way, I should say this as well. It's universally agreed upon by scholars today that a key factor to Christianity spreading throughout the world so quickly was the uniformity of language, which was introduced by the Greeks and maintained by the Romans. This uniformity of language is key to why the church spread across the world the way that it did. Also, the Greek theater, which introduced entertainment into the world in a way that they had never seen before, was seen as a progressive teaching tool by those more forward-minding Jews. They saw it as a means to communicate God's word in creative ways, that might actually be receptive. They were progressively minded. However, at the same time, there was the conservative camp, and they felt that Greek culture was dangerous. They felt that it was contaminating their faith, and they saw it as a path back to their old idolatrous ways, which, by the way, caused them to be carried off to Babylon in the first place centuries prior. And they were saying to themselves, we're partnering with the world, we're being contaminated by their sin, and God's going to judge us for it. Does that sound familiar? We're being contaminated. If God doesn't judge America, we're going to have to apologize for Sodom and Gomorrah, that kind of thing. That's going on in their mind. And so this similar tension exists today. It's a very real thing. Now, Israel initially worked to limit the influence of Hellenization. As it was spreading, they tended to work to limit it. And they did so right up to the time of Antiochus IV. They couldn't stop it. That was impossible, but they worked to keep it out of Israel as much as possible. And the high priests up to that point were instrumental in this effort. Onias III in particular was the high priest when Antiochus IV ascended, and he was among that long line of high priests before him who attempted to hold the line against the Hellenization of Judea. However, over time, more and more Jews were emerging with the mind to get more with the times on the Hellenization issue. And some of them were saying, maybe it's time to get some new leadership at the top. Let's get some of them old conservatives are kind of holding us back. Let's get with the times. We need a fresh coat of paint with the leadership. We need a change, that kind of thing. One such person was named Jason. He was the brother of Onias III. And he made a play for the high priesthood with this goal in mind. And we'll talk about him in just a moment. But first, I want to briefly mention that there were also differences in outlook among the Greek ruling class. Oh, see, I missed a slide. So there was differences of opinion in Israel. There's also differences of opinion amongst the world leaders. The Greek ruling class at that time had differences as well. In all fairness, they did all seem to have the goal of assimilating culture to Greek. They did seem to have that goal. However, most embraced kind of that long game policy, which was to influence the world with Greek culture until it permeated everything. And this seems to have been the position of the Greek kings who ruled Judea clear up to Antiochus III. And the policy, from what I can see, was working just fine. They were making great headway with that. However, there were some who felt that the cultural resistance to Hellenization, like that which came from the Jews, was holding back progress. They felt that the current long game policy was insufficient, and they felt that more overt measures should be taken to stop resistance and to speed up progress for the sake of all mankind. We need to force this issue more. This is not going fast enough. Antiochus IV was of that mind. Okay? Now that the stage is set, though, let's look at how this whole situation led to Antiochus IV persecuting the Jews and desecrating the temple, okay? There are several steps which culminate in the abomination of desolation. The first was taken by Jason, the guy that I just mentioned, when he bribed Antiochus IV to take the high priesthood from his brother Onias III and give it to him instead, okay? Jason bribed Antiochus IV and says, give it to me, and he took it from Onias III. And I don't know if you remember when I mentioned that the right combination of corruption could lead to problems. This is that step I was talking about. Jason promised Antiochus IV higher tribute from Judea and an increased policy of Hellenization if he was the high priest instead of Onias III. Antiochus IV was like, sounds good to me, makes sense. You got it. More money for me, more Hellenization for me, you got it. And he gave it to him. And in all fairness, Jason's administration, which lasted about 3 years, was by and large successful. He did strengthen Hellenism in Judea. He did this in particular by building a gymnasium near Jerusalem and by introducing more Greek language and culture into the educational system. But more importantly, he was careful enough to maintain core Jewish laws and tenets that the Jewish public was generally satisfied with. And so they were satisfied with his rule. And by all accounts, Jason appears to have been a pretty able statesman who probably had the well-being of his country in mind. He probably felt that his brother's conservatism was holding up progress, and he seemed to be capable in the policies he was leading. However, his fatal mistake was to partner with a man that was completely devoid of conscience. That is Antiochus IV. And to partner with him in an act of dishonor, which was to betray his brother and to bribe, to kind of stab him in the back in order to get towards his noble goals. And what I'm trying to say here is that Jason thought to himself, I have a good end in mind, and the means don't matter so much. You know, I have to do this morally sketchy thing, but it's going to be okay because it's going to be great for the nation. So I'm going to make this partnership at this time, and it's going to all work out great. But the lesson to learn here is that the end never, ever, ever justifies the means. If you have to sell your soul to get there, you're making a mistake. It never works out. And that's exactly what Jason did here, and it's going to bite him, okay? So and here's how it starts to bite him. The next step down the dark path came when someone else decided to follow Jason's example, all right? His name was Menelaus. Menelaus bribed Antiochus IV to take the high priesthood from Jason and give it to him in exchange for even higher tribute and an even stronger policy of Hellenization. This is what happens when you make a deal with the devil and everyone watches. You know what I'm saying? Someone comes along and says, well, maybe I could do the same thing, and it could work for me. That's exactly what happened here. So this guy just saw what Jason did. He did more of the same. However, unlike Jason, who was tolerated and even respected by some of the people, Menelaus was despised by the people from the very beginning. And this is the truth for a couple of reasons. He did not have family legitimacy, for one. Jason did. Jason was the brother of the high priest. What he pulled was sketchy, but he was still part of the family. So they were able to accept that. Menelaus was a complete outsider. No one knew who this guy was at all. And this was very offensive to the people. Also, the exorbitant promises that he made to Antiochus IV forced him to levy oppressive taxes and even rob the temple itself for items of value to make payment to Antiochus for the promises that he made. This was extremely offensive to the Jews. Jason never did anything like this. All right? And also, when Menelaus' offenses began to spark civil unrest, he appealed to Antiochus IV for support. which appears to have prompted an invasion by Antiochus in 169 BC, and more robbing and plundering of the land. What that means is that when the people started pushing back against him, he would call to Antiochus. Antiochus would come in, and he would restore order. And whenever Antiochus came, there was more plundering. And so the quality of life in Jerusalem in Judea is going way down as a result of what Menelaus did. And for this reason, Menelaus was despised by the Jewish nation, which leads to the next step down the spiral, which is that 3 years into Menelaus's troubled administration, Jason hears that Antiochus IV was killed in battle while away on his campaign in Egypt, and he sees this as an opportunity and leads a revolt against Menelaus. He's like, I'm taking it back, And because Menelaus was so unpopular, and they're thinking back about the way Jason was, that was a little sketchy, but this guy was great compared to this guy. A lot of the people got behind Jason and supported him in the revolt. It was relatively successful in the beginning. Menelaus was forced into hiding. However, as it turns out, they made one very, very huge mistake. They thought Antiochus was dead, and he was not. He was alive and well and kicking. And in fact, he had just been humiliated by Rome and turned back from his evasion attempt. In our last study, I talked a little bit about it. But as he was heading down, Rome intervened. And this is where he says, you got to head back. And he said, let me think about it. And they drew a circle around him and said, just have your answer before you step outside this circle. It was humiliating. And so he was fuming about that humiliation. As he's heading back from that, he hears news that a revolt has taken place in Jerusalem, and Menelaus has been pushed into hiding by Jason. And Antiochus received this news as an attack on his own sovereignty and marched towards Jerusalem. Not good. You can guess what happens next, okay? Next, seething from his humiliation from Rome, Antiochus marches into Jerusalem and gave full vent to his rage. He went on a rampage. He murdered and pillaged throughout the city. Jason is defeated. He escapes. He flees. He doesn't get killed, but he flees. Menelaus is reinstated by Antiochus. He's kind of his puppet. And it is here that those more systematic policies, which forcibly Hellenize the Jews and eradicate Judaism, begin. All right? There is actually a military fortress set up in Jerusalem in view of the temple. It's known as the Acra, and was set up as a base of military operations for ongoing martial law. That is to say, he went in and he kept a military presence there, and he built a military barracks near the temple that could spy on the temple. And so when people went up to worship in the temple, they would march out and they would kill them. That's what was happening. And at the same time, there was pressure to forsake God and to worship idols, and anyone who did it were rewarded. And so there was this systematic pressure to completely paganize the nation and to eradicate Judaism. There was capital punishment if circumcision was applied to the children or of worship of any kind. This is when that all goes down upon the return from Egypt after this rebellion by Jason. It is also in this time period that Antiochus IV desecrated the temple by setting up that altar to Zeus inside and sacrificing a pig on the altar, which is the abomination of desolation. That's how we get to that point, all right? Now, this is the situation where we find Judea in when the Maccabean revolt begins, okay? At this time, in a little village called Modin, a Seleucid official entered this small town to compel the inhabitants to make a sacrifice to the Greek gods. This is a systematic thing at this point. They're forcing this on everybody. And Mattathias was the name of a local priest in this town, and he was ordered by this Seleucid official to make the sacrifice, and he outright refused, and the tension started to build. And another priest in the town was fearing the reprisals from Antiochus IV's military. He stepped forward and agreed to make the sacrifice and prepared to do so. And as he began to make the sacrifice, Mattathias stepped forward and killed that priest right where he stood, just killed him right there. And then he turned around and he killed the Seleucid official who attempted to coerce the town to worship idols. And then he fled with his 5 sons into the hills, where they were slowly joined by like-minded Jews, and together they formed a resistance with one goal. And that goal was to cleanse the entire land of Greek influence and Greek culture once and for all, to get it all out. The Hellenization has been the problem all along. We're going to get it all out of here by whatever means we have to. We will resort. There's nothing we won't do to get this stuff out of here. And so begins the Maccabean revolt. And that's where we're going to leave it this time. Do you want to know how the Maccabean revolt goes? Stay tuned. Okay, for the next episode, because that's where we're going to get into the details of the battles themselves. But the reason I'm stopping here is because there's specifics about the way that they went about it that you really need to understand. And remember how I told you before that the end never justifies the means? I mean, that applies no matter whose side you're on. That applies as much to these guys as it applies to anyone else. And so we got some specifics here. And I want to work through this with some more detail so that you can see what's going on, because all this is helpful to understand as we unpack the Olivet Discourse.